Excuse me.
Okay, we are currently going through the verses in the Bible where we find the word mystery or mysteries. So last week we talked about Romans 11:25, and then near the end we looked in Romans 16, and we'll go back there in a moment. But in Romans chapter 16 and verse 25, Paul uses the term "my gospel." And so we talked about that last week. We saw three times Paul uses the term "my gospel," and 3 times he uses the term "our gospel," and then other similar terms. And then as we were concluding last week, we went to Luke and Matthew, and I pointed out that the 12 apostles were sent out preaching the gospel, but they didn't even know yet that Christ was going to die and rise again from the dead. And then later, when he told them, it says they understood none of these things, and Peter rebuked Jesus. So my point at this time was that clearly in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were not preaching what Paul refers to as "my gospel," because the cross and the resurrection are central to what Paul refers to as "my gospel." And I want to begin today in Mark chapter 16 and look at another passage where it speaks of preaching the gospel. Mark chapter 16 and beginning in verse 14. Afterward he appeared unto the 11 as they sat at meat, and upbraided them with their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they believed not them which had seen him after he was risen. And he said unto them, Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils, they shall speak with new tongues, they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. So here in this passage in Mark 16, Jesus instructed the 11 apostles. Of course, Judas Iscariot was off the scene by this time. So Jesus instructed the 11 apostles to preach the gospel. So this commission, as we just read, was given to the Jewish apostles, the 11, and of course later there was a 12th added. But it's not given to the church, the body of Christ, which of course didn't even yet exist when Christ spoke these words in Mark 16. And as we can see plainly in verse 16, water baptism was part of this gospel. Keep Mark open, but turn over for a moment to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and Gene Gross, would you read verse 17?
1 Corinthians 1, right?
Yep.
17.
Yep.
For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect.
So it's clear, just comparing Mark chapter 16, verse 16 with 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 17, that these are not the same gospel. Because we just read in Mark 16, Christ clearly instructed them to preach a gospel, and along with that to water baptize. But Paul says, Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel. So water baptism is not a part of the gospel that Paul's speaking about here. Okay, then go back again to Mark 16. And also we read here in Mark chapter 16 that those who believe the gospel, spoken of here in Mark 16, will cast out devils and speak with new tongues. And so there are many churches today who continually preach verse 15. Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And they say this is one of the verses. They say this is the Great Commission that we're supposed to be carrying out. And so again, they often will read or quote verse 15. some of them will mention verse 16. Some of them don't really like verse 16. But even if they're okay with verse 16, they don't like verse 17. And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils, they shall speak with new tongues. So you have churches that will water baptize. So again, they're somewhat okay with verse 16. No, many of them still have a problem with it, but they're somewhat okay with it. But then they don't practice speaking in tongues and casting out devils. So they don't like verse 17. And then there are some churches that like verse 17 okay because they're pretending that they're doing those things. But then they don't like verse 18. They shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. So in verse 18, those who believe will not only heal the sick, but they will also take up serpents and drink deadly things, but not be harmed. And so these verses simply won't, especially verse 18, simply won't work today. From time to time over many years, I will see in a newspaper, I've seen some in India, and I've seen some about Tennessee in America, where some church will claim this verse and they will release deadly snakes in their service. And it's in the newspaper because people get bitten and get very ill and sometimes die. So it just is not going to work today. So this gospel that Mark 16 speaks about is a gospel that will be preached in the future in that 70th week of Daniel, that time when Israel will have tribulation. So this is a very different gospel from what Paul refers to as my gospel.
Hey, Dan.
Yes.
Question for you. How valid is the position that these last verses of Mark 16 are really not in the most manuscripts, or whatever the case might be, to kind of discredit that section?
Yeah, good question. So as I just briefly pointed out, and I think you can all see, these, again, they all like verse 15, but then 16, 17, and especially 18 present a problem. And so one of the ways that they deal with that is they say that verse 14 through 20 should not be in the Bible. And they claim that they'll have often some statement that saying that the earliest and best manuscripts don't contain these verses. So there are some Bible translations you can get that will end in verse 13. The other verses are just gone. Many, excuse me, many translations will have verses 14 through 20, but often they will put them in italics and then have a footnote saying, as I said, saying that the earliest and best manuscripts don't contain these verses. So they'll cast doubt upon whether they should even be in the Bible. And so to make a long story short, they have found 602 manuscripts that contain Mark chapter 16. 600 of them have these verses, 2 of them do not. And so the modern translations, many of them, they choose those 2 manuscripts and ignore the 600. The King James takes the 600 and they come to the conclusion that those two are in error, that they're corrupt manuscripts. So it's, I believe there's no validity whatsoever to removing these verses or casting doubt upon these verses. They're fully the Word of God. All right, then let's turn to Acts chapter 2. That, by the way, sometimes you will hear the text that the King James translators used. You will hear hear it referred to as the majority text. So that would be an example of that, where there's 602 manuscripts. And so they go, if there's any discrepancy between them, they go with the majority, with the 600, and conclude that the two are corrupt. All right, then in Acts chapter 2, many preachers and commentators, of course, teach that the church, the body of Christ, began in Acts chapter 2, and therefore that the gospel preached here in Acts chapter 2 would be the gospel that we preach today, and the same gospel that Paul preached. But again, without taking a great deal of time in this chapter, in Acts chapter 2, Dick, would you read verse 36?
Okay. Acts 2:36. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God hath made that same Jesus, whom you have crucified, both Lord and Christ.
So you can easily see in Acts chapter 2 that Peter was preaching to the house of Israel. He's not preaching to the church, a body of Christ, which again didn't even yet exist. And he's not preaching to Gentiles. He's preaching to the house of Israel. And as you read carefully through what Peter says here in Acts chapter 2, you see that the cross is not preached as good news in Acts chapter 2. Of course, for us today, that is the gospel, the good news about the cross of Christ. But in Acts chapter 2, Peter does not speak of the cross as good news. Instead, he blames the men of Israel for crucifying the Lord and the Christ. And then as Peter blames them for that and warns them of judgment, they get convicted and ask what they should do. So again, in Acts chapter 2, Meg, would you read verses 37 and 38?
Acts 2:37, 38. Now when they heard this, they were pricked in their heart, and said unto Peter and to the rest of the apostles, Men and brethren, what shall we do? Then Peter said unto them, Repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, for the remission of sins, and ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost.
So when they are pricked in their heart and they ask, what shall we do? Peter didn't say, believe in the cross of Christ for forgiveness of your sins. Instead, as Meg just read, he told them to repent and be baptized. And again, we've already looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 17, where Paul said, Christ sent me not to baptize. So again, these can't possibly be the same gospels, where Peter says, repent and be baptized, and Paul says that he was not sent to baptize, but to preach the gospel. And then before we move on from Acts 2, again in Acts chapter 2, George, would you read verses 39 and 40?
For the promise is unto you and to your children and to all that are far off, even as many as the Lord our God shall call. And with many other words did he testify and exhort, saying, Save yourselves from this untoward generation.
So the issue here in Acts chapter 2 in Peter's preaching is not salvation from hell or even salvation from sin, but it's salvation from the untoward generation. And we've talked about that briefly in the past, that there's an important doctrine going all the way back to Moses about this untoward generation. And that's the salvation that he's speaking of here. So again, the gospel here in Acts chapter 2 is very different than what Paul refers to as my gospel. So there, as we've studied quite a lot when we were beginning 1 Corinthians 15, we talked about the gospel in quite a lot of detail. And so we saw there are many gospels in the Bible. There's the gospel of the kingdom, the gospel of the circumcision, the gospel of the uncircumcision, the gospel of peace, the gospel of the grace of God, and others. But in this dispensation, there's only one gospel. Turn to Galatians chapter 1. Galatians chapter 1. And Dominic, would you read verses 6 and 7 in Galatians chapter 1?
I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ.
Okay, so Paul marveled that the Galatians so quickly turned to another gospel after they had been called into the grace of Christ. By the way, in verse 6, where Paul says, I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. The word him there does not refer to Christ. That's how most people interpret that they were removed from Christ. But that's not what he's talking about. The word him there refers to Paul. Paul is the one that called them into the grace of Christ. And it's Paul from whom they were quickly removed. Okay, then again in Galatians chapter 1, would Dan or Lisa read verses 8 and 9? Galatians chapter 1, verses 8 and 9.
But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you, that to which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As we said before, to say I now again, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than that ye have received, let him be accursed.
All right, so Paul says if anyone preaches another gospel other than the one that Paul preached, Paul says, let him be accursed. And by the way, that accursed does not mean, as some translations have, let him be eternally damned. That's not at all what it means. Let him be accursed is more the idea of being excommunicated or of not fellowshipping with such a person or working with them in the ministry. So the only true gospel today is the gospel that Paul preached. And again, he refers to that as my gospel. Okay, then going on to Galatians chapter 2, and we won't spend a long time here, but this is an extremely interesting and important chapter. So I'll read beginning in chapter 2 and verse 1. Then 14 years after, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. By the way, this is a very provocative move for Paul to choose to take Titus with him when he goes to Jerusalem, because Titus was an uncircumcised Gentile. So Paul was very well aware, rather than trying to avoid any issues when he went to Jerusalem, Paul clearly provoked this to become an issue by choosing to bring Titus with him. Verse 2, and I went up by revelation and committed unto them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. So notice Paul says, I communicated unto them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles. Peter, James, and John did not teach Paul the gospel, but Paul taught them the gospel that he was preaching. Verse 3, but neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. So as Paul knew they would do, they tried to compel Titus to be circumcised. Verse 4, and that because of false brethren unawares brought in who came in privily to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage. And verse 4 has been a very helpful verse for me for many, many years, because I am aware that this sort of thing frequently takes place in our day too. And we all need to be aware of certain people who in various ways will try to get into our ministry or church or have influence in our lives in one way or another. Sometimes they come in like wolves, sometimes like sheep, but their purpose is at the end of verse 4 that they might bring us into bondage. And so we have to be, as Paul was and Titus was, we have to be discerning to recognize that. Okay, verse 5, to whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. But of these who seem to be somewhat, notice how he speaks of Peter, James, and John here. Of these who seemed to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter to me. God accepteth no man's person. For they who seemed to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. So notice Peter, James, and John did not teach Paul anything. He says they added nothing to me. But contrary-wise, in verse 7, contrary-wise, Paul did teach them things that they didn't know. So verse 7, but contrary-wise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. So clearly in verse 7, you have two different gospels. You have the gospel of the circumcision that was committed to Peter, and then you have the gospel of the uncircumcision committed to Paul. Clearly not the same gospel. And then verse 8, for he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles. Peter and Paul also had different apostleships. Peter, of course, is one of the 12 with an apostleship of the circumcision, and Paul was the apostle of the Gentiles. And then verse 9, and when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen and they unto the circumcision. And so in verse 9, we see Peter and Paul had different commissions. So verse 7, they had different gospels. Verse 8, they had different apostleships. And verse 9, they had different commissions. By the way, the most translations in verse 9, they say that Paul and Barnabas will go to the Gentiles and Peter, James, and John to the Jews. And I've heard many people, even people using the King James, that will teach it like that. But that's incorrect. And in fact, the translations that change those words in verse 9, they make Paul and Barnabas and Peter, James, and John all to be liars. So if Paul was agreeing in verse 9 that we will go unto the Gentiles, after this agreement in Galatians 2, we can read in the book of Acts many times Paul went into a city and went into the synagogue and preached to the Jews. So if Paul's agreement is we will go to the Gentiles, then Paul lied to them. And actually the same with Peter, James, and John. If their agreement is that we will go to the Jews, they also lied, because after this, we don't find Peter, James, and John going to unsaved Jews. And so if they were promising we will go to the Jews, they didn't do so. So the correct words are in the King James. Paul and Barnabas say we will go to the heathen, and that's what they did. They went to the heathen, the unsaved, both Jew and Gentile, whether it's in a synagogue or in the market, wherever it might be. They preached salvation to the heathen, the Jews and Gentiles who were unsaved. And after this agreement in Galatians 2, Peter, James, and John went to the circumcision. They went to those Jews who had been saved with the kingdom gospel earlier and were under that kingdom gospel program. So we don't, when we read where they went, what they did, who they wrote to, they wrote, James says he's writing to the 12 tribes scattered abroad and so forth. So they went to the circumcision, not to the Gentiles, but not even to the unsaved Jews. So that's another case where it's very important to use the King James. All right, let's go back. Yep.
Sorry for another question. Can
Mhm.
you shed some light on verse 7, where the King James is using, obviously, what we believe to be the correct verbiage here, that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, and the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter, whereas the other versions say preaching the gospel to. Is there any any understanding there as to can those words really be used interchangeably like that, or are they misleading?
Yeah, that's another good question. And that, of course, most of Christendom, they tried to make the gospel that Paul preached the same as the gospel that Peter preached, the same as the gospel in Acts 2 and in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and so forth. And so this verse 7 in the King James is a problem for them because the wording in the King James, you clearly have two different gospels, the gospel of the circumcision and the gospel of the uncircumcision. So many of the modern translations change that, and it says the gospel to the circumcision and the gospel to the uncircumcision. And then they teach that there's only one gospel, but Peter was called to preach that gospel to the circumcision, and Paul was called to preach the same gospel to the uncircumcision. So that little two-letter word, whether it's of or to, becomes extremely important. And again, I have no question that the correct translation is in the King James. It should be the word of, not the word to. But without trying to pretend that I'm a Greek expert and so on and so forth, one of the problems, if you take that idea that it's there's only one gospel, but Peter's taking it to one group and Paul to the other group. My question then is, if there is only one gospel, why is there a group of circumcised saints and another group of uncircumcised saints? And in fact, there's a time when they wouldn't have anything to do with one another. So if it's only one gospel, why is that? That one group is getting circumcised and one is not. So that's, even without talking about the Greek or the text or anything, that's a problem for
Right.
those who try to change the King James.
Right. So what you're saying is that if it's really two, then they are continuing the practice of circumcision, and Paul is not. So why are they both doing something different? Is what your point is there, correct?
Yeah, and not even necessarily continuing, but in the past, they had all been getting circumcised,
Right.
under Peter, James, and John, and that gospel of the kingdom. But with Paul now, there's a new group that's not being circumcised. So again, if it's the same gospel, why these two different groups?
Right.
All right, let's go to Romans 16 then. So Romans chapter 16, and again, we went to this passage briefly last week and are going there again now because of the use of the word mystery. So in Romans chapter 16 and beginning again in verse 25, now to him that is of power to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery, which was kept secret since the world began, but now is made manifest, and by the scriptures of the prophets according to the commandment of the everlasting God, made known to all nations for the obedience of faith. So Paul says here that we are established by three things. And before we talk about those three things, notice that the word here is establish. And then we'll come right back, but turn over to chapter 1 in Romans. Romans chapter 1. And would Dan or Laura read verse 11? Romans chapter 1, verse 11.
Romans 1:11, for I long to see you, that I may impart unto you some spiritual gift, to the end ye may be established.
All right, so notice the word here in the same book, in Romans, the word here is established. Now, there are a number of examples like this in the King James Bible, and there are many, including people who use the King James, that say that the meaning of these words is the same thing, and one of them is just more antiquated and the other more updated. And I won't take a long time talking about that now, but I completely disagree with that. One reason being, why in the very same epistle would Paul choose in one case to use an outdated, antiquated word, and then in another place use a more modern word? And in fact, from what some say, Paul used the more modern word here in chapter 1, and then at the end of the book in chapter 16, he uses this supposedly outdated or antiquated word. So I completely disagree with that. I believe that they're different words with different meanings, and that's significant. So the word establish with the E used here in Romans chapter 1, verse 11, that has the idea of laying a foundation. And so when Paul says in verse 11, I long to see you that I may impart unto you some spiritual gift to the end ye may be established. Paul's saying, I want to lay a foundation. But on the other hand, the word establish in chapter 16 and verse 25, without the E, that has the idea of building upon the foundation. And it has to do with a building process that has become complete. So in chapter 16 and verse 25, now to him that has power to establish you. Paul's saying there that God has the power to, the foundation's already laid, but God has the power to build upon that foundation to its completion, is the idea in Romans 16:25 with the word establish. We'll come right back to Romans 16, but turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3 for a moment.
And could I give another explanation of that?
If it's correct.
Well, one of the ways that I learned about this was that Nancy, being a master gardener and such, when she established her plan for the plants in the backyard and planted them, she established the garden. But once the garden had matured and hardened off, the garden was then established. She didn't have to take care of it so much. She could build upon that. And so I had to have something a little more concrete, with these hard words for me. And that's what helped me a lot.
Yeah, that'd be a good illustration of the correct use of those words.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, then 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and Aaron, would you read verse 11?
1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 11. For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ.
Okay, so Jesus Christ is the foundation. And Paul says, I laid the foundation. And so God now wants us to build on that foundation and to be established. Whether you use a building example or the gardening example that Dick mentioned, he wants us now to be established. All right, then back in Romans 16. So again, in Romans 16, verses 25 and 26, there are three things that establish us, and the order is important. So the first thing in verse 25 is my gospel. And I believe that's a reference to the first 4 chapters in Romans, which we've gone through in some detail in past weeks, where Paul clearly lays out how man, both in time past and now, Jew and Gentile, can be justified by faith. So that's the starting point. That's the first thing that everyone needs to be established, is they have to have an understanding of, not every detail, but a general understanding of the gospel presented in Romans chapters 1 through 4. And of course, they must believe it. So that's the first thing. The second thing that establishes us in verse 25 is the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery, which was kept secret since the world began. And the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery is found in Paul's epistles, and only in Paul's epistles. And so I believe that's what he's referring to with this second thing, the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery. He's referring to his epistles, Paul's epistles. Turn for a moment over to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and Richard, would you read verse 16?
Okay, 2 Corinthians 5:16. Wherefore henceforth know we no man after the flesh, yea, though we have known Christ after the flesh, yet now henceforth not know we him no more.
All right, so Paul says that we no more know or preach Christ after the flesh, or according to the flesh. We instead today preach Christ according to the revelation of the mystery. So we don't preach Christ today, or at least we ought not to. Sadly, most churches do. But we ought not to preach Christ today as he was while he was on earth. Turn to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, and would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 7?
But made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men.
Okay, so when Jesus Christ was on earth, he took upon him the form of a servant. He made himself of no reputation. So when Jesus Christ was on earth, he became hungry, he became tired. You could spit at him, you could slap him, you could even crucify him. And of course, they did all those things. So when Jesus Christ was on earth, he was, for a very short time in human history, he was in a state where he humbled himself. That is not who Jesus Christ is today, and that's not how we are to preach Jesus Christ today. We are to preach him according to the revelation of the mystery. He's now the head of the church, the body of Christ. And turn to Ephesians chapter 1. Ephesians chapter 1, and Gabrielle, would you read verses 20 through 22?
Ephesians 1, 20 through 22, which he wrought in Christ when he raised him from the dead and set him at his own right hand in the heavenly places, far above all principality and power and might and dominion, and every name that is named, not only in this world, but also in that which is to come, and hath put all things under his feet, and gave him to be the head over all things to the church.
Okay, so this is who Jesus Christ is today. He's He's not in a state of being humbled, taking upon having no being of no reputation and taking upon him the form of a servant, but instead now he is far above all principality and power and might and dominion and every name that is named. So this is how we are to preach Christ today, again, according to the revelation of the mystery. And again, the mystery is revealed in Paul's epistles. Right, let's go back to Romans 16. So in Romans chapter 16 and verse 25, Paul says this mystery was kept secret since the world began. So no one knew this mystery until it was revealed to Paul. So why did God keep this mystery a secret for all these years until Paul? And when we won't get there tonight, but when we look at next week at the next time in the Bible that we find the word mystery, we will find that Paul answers that question of why God kept this mystery a secret. So again, the word mystery in the Bible always means something that was not known in the past, but now it's revealed. The word mystery in the Bible never means something mysterious. And so the word mystery is a very important Bible word. And it's really shocking and shameful that most Christians have no understanding or knowledge of the meaning of the word mystery in the Bible. In fact, many Christians, if you would say to them, do you know about the mystery, or can I tell you about the mystery? They would think you're in some kind of weird cult using the word mystery. But again, it's a very important Bible word. And so there are many churches you could attend them for years and never hear them talk about the word mystery, certainly not, if at all, certainly not in a correct manner. All right, let's go back to Romans 16. In verse 26, but now is made manifest, and he's referring back to that mystery, but now it's made manifest, and by the scriptures of the prophets, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, made known to all nations for the obedience of faith. So Paul says that the mystery, which had been kept secret since the world began, is now made manifest. And again, it's made manifest through Paul's epistles. So the first thing that establishes us is my gospel, Romans 1 through 4. The second thing that establishes us is the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery, and that would be Paul's epistles. And then the third thing is that is in verse 26, we must study the scriptures of the prophets. So the scriptures of the prophets here refers to the rest of the Bible, everything in the Bible that's not written by Paul. So Paul's epistles alone tell us about the church, the body of Christ, and the present dispensation of grace. In Paul's epistles alone, we have the revelation of the mystery, which he speaks of here in Romans 16. And so the rest of the Bible, everything other than Paul's epistles, the rest of the Bible reveals the prophecy program. And so these three things establish us. And again, the order is very important. So first, we must understand my gospel in Romans 1 through 4. And if we understand that and believe it, then we will be justified and have eternal life. Then we must study Paul's epistles and understand the revelation of the mystery. And then thirdly, the rest of the Bible, the scriptures of the prophets. And then in verse 26, he says, all three of these things are according to the commandment of the everlasting God. So God is the one who spoke to the prophets since the world began about his plan for the earth. And God is the one who revealed the mystery, kept it a secret, but then revealed it to Paul. And again, Paul writes about that concerning God's plan for the church, the body of Christ in the heavens. And then he says in verse 26 that all three of these things have been made known to all nations for the obedience of faith. And so what does he mean, that phrase, the obedience of faith? Look back in Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, and would Tim or Jean read verse 5?
Okay, Romans 1:5. By whom we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith among all nations for his name.
All right, so we see the phrase here also, obedience of faith. And then look in chapter 6 in Romans. And this verse in Romans 6, I believe, will help us a great deal in correctly defining what that phrase means, or the obedience of faith. So Romans chapter 6, and Akun, would you read verse 17?
Romans 6:17, but God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you.
Okay, so this verse, I believe, helps a great deal to explain the meaning of that phrase. So, because this verse, verse 17, speaks of unsaved people who obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine. So, in other words, they believe the gospel. So, obedience to the faith is simply believing God's word, believing God's message. And so, in this case, the message is Paul's gospel and the revelation of the mystery. And then again, after that, the scriptures of the prophets. And so that's what Paul's talking about in Romans 16:26. All three of these things were given for the obedience of faith, for us to understand and believe. Look at John chapter 6. And this is a different context than Romans 16, of course, but it's a somewhat similar example. John chapter 6. And Paul, would you read verse 29?
Jesus answered and said unto them, This is the work of God, that ye believe on him whom he hath sent.
So we often would think of work or obedience as being not faith, something contrasting faith. But he says here, Jesus said, this is the work of God, that ye believe on him whom he hath sent. And so a similar thing with that phrase, obedience of faith. Obedience of faith is not talking about doing something. It's talking about believing, having faith. Okay, then let's go back again to Romans 16. By the way, Romans chapter 6 at verse 17 is a problem for Calvinists, because they have a doctrine saying that man is depraved, and they define that as meaning that man is depraved to the extent where they cannot do anything good, including believing. And so they say that God has to give us the gift of faith and so forth. So, but in Romans 6:17, you have unbelievers, servants of sin, obeying from the heart the form of doctrine which was delivered to them. So that's one of several places we can see in the Bible that Calvinist doctrine is not true. Unsaved people indeed can believe. They can't do any works to please God, but they can choose to believe. All right, then Romans chapter 16, and just to conclude the epistle of Romans here, verse 27. To God only wise be glory through Jesus Christ forever. Amen. So Paul concludes Romans by giving praise to God only wise. And then he says that God deserves and will receive glory through Jesus Christ forever. So the mystery that Paul refers to in Romans chapter 16 and verse 25 is clearly not the same as the mysteries of the kingdom that we looked at in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Because Paul says in verse 25 that this mystery was kept secret since the world began. So Paul could not say that if Christ had already spoken about this mystery when he was on earth. So it can't be the same as the mysteries in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The mystery that Paul refers to in Romans 16:25 was not revealed at that time. It's only through Paul. Again, Paul says in verse 26, but now is made manifest. Now, just one or two quick thoughts and we'll be done for today. But when Paul wrote Romans, and when he wrote Romans 16:25, the revelation of the mystery was not yet complete. Yeah, at this point, the revelation of the mystery included Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. So they had that much of the revelation of the mystery. But there was further revelation of the mystery yet to come. And of course, that was given in Paul's other epistles. And then finally, one final comment today. The mystery that Paul refers to in Romans 16:25 is a general or broad term referring to all of Paul's epistles. Last week, we talked about the mystery in Romans chapter 11 and verse 25, where he says this mystery, and that's a very specific mystery, as we talked about last week, regarding when and why the blindness in part that has happened unto Israel will come to an end. So this mystery in Romans 11:25 would fit under the broader category of the mystery that Paul refers to here in chapter 16, verse 25. All right, we will stop there for today, and then next time we will look at the next time in the Bible that we find the word mystery. So thank you all.
Thank you, Dan. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
And